ES6 comes with three distinct data types. The first data type is var, which I'm sure you already know how to work with, which has a function scope. So it basically is available to anything within the scope of the current function that you're in. Contrary to that, the let and const, which are new, are bounded by the curly bracket scope really in many ways. So they're bounded by internally into the scope of the whatever element that they're in, if it's a for loop, if it's an if condition, or if it's a function for that matter. The difference between let and const is let is more like a variable besides that fact, and a const is for constants, which for things that you're not going to change once you assign them. So let's see them in action. Before we move on, I want to talk about one more ES6 thing that is really cool, won't take us too long, but incredibly powerful and useful to make your application even more efficient. So to showcase this, I'm just going to go into our client. So far we were using our var, and our var per se, and let me do this inside of our portfolio. Our var per se is basically a variable that we define. In this case, anything that we define within our module is private, so only this has access to it. No one could gain access to it. So if I create your var and I call it name, and I set it to be, or let's do version, right? And our version is going to be 1.0.1, let's say. Now, this version by default is completely unavailable, but the problem with our version is that our version itself might be changeable because, well, changeable, which is a good thing if you want it to be changeable. But in our case, once I set my version to be version 1, I'm really kind of saying I don't want it to change anymore. And I want to show you how do you actually create a situation where no one can change it. Now, in this case, for example, in our version, I'm just going to go ahead and I want to expose it first of all. So let's go ahead and I'm going to expose it by publishing it, by exporting it. Now, first of all, if I go to my version and I export it and I go into my client, and I'm just going to go ahead and do here a console log, and I'm going to try and gain access to it. So first of all, if it's exported, I'm going to need to gain access to it. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and, although right now I was loading portfolio and portfolio item, but portfolio item doesn't exist anymore. So let me go ahead here and load in version. Now, if I take in my version, and let me double check that I wrote it correctly, version, there we go. So I'm importing my version, right? Because it's not one of the defaults, it's imported. Now, if I go ahead and I just log that version and I go ahead into and look to see what's going to come out, I'm going to see that version 1.01 comes out. If I go into that version and I say, oh, by the way, version, I want you to be version 2.1 from now on. Now, if I do that just before I called that version, then what's actually going to happen is, first of all, because we're working in separate, because we're moving things from one area to another, by default, they're constants. So I'm going to get an error telling me, whoa, you're not allowed to do that. Now, in a situation that works perfectly, that's protecting me from overriding and changing that version, because this is a variable, and if a variable is being exposed, it's treated as something that shouldn't be changed. Makes a lot of sense. But what would happen if I tried to change this variable within my application? So if I go inside of here and I type your version, and I completely forgot, and in my version I went ahead and I called it to version 2, for example, and it runs again this time around, and let me just make sure that everything here is kosher. So automatically, because I set it and assigned it to be with the version, it did not protect me. So in this case, we could see that we're going to version 2, even though I really don't want it to change. And for that was born the const. And const will basically make sure that if I try to change it, even within my application, it's going to make sure that it's not changeable. It's going to throw an error. It's going to tell me, whoa, buddy, you're not allowed to change this version, which is exactly what we wanted it to do. Now, there's a few cool things related to these types of variables that are different, so I want to show them to you. So if I have here a variable, and I'm just going to call it name, and I'm going to call it Ben, for example, and I do my console call, log of name. Then obviously I have access to the scope. Now what would happen if I would put a bracket, opening and closing bracket, which really doesn't mean too much for us, and I'm creating here a variable. If I go ahead and save this and run my application, I'm still going to have access to Ben. Why? Because our variable is defined based on the function scope that is near it. And the function scope that is near it is our full portfolio area. On contrary, if I would use something that's called let is defined based on the last opening and closing brackets. It's a self-enclosed area. So a let, on contrary to var, will not gain access. So if I try to run that, you'll see that we don't have a value in there. We don't have the value Ben inside of it because we created a let and not a var. Now the same applies also for const. So if I have here a const is only available within the bounds of the last block that it was in. Contrary to variables, vars, that are available within the function block. So even if I define here a const and I define here a var name2, and I set that Ben2, and I try to log it out, our name2 will be available, but our name shouldn't be available because it is only within the scope of the block that it's within. And by the way, you could have other blocks within here and they would still have access to the const, they would still have access to the var, but in the case of the var, it will live outside of that scope as well because it will live within this scope really. So if we give it a try and we run it, we'll see that once it runs, we'll see that Ben2 is coming through because it's a var, but our first Ben is not because it's a const. Same as applies for a let. So again, const never changes. Let does change, but its scope is a little bit different, and this comes really useful mainly in situations such as we've just worked in, where for example we're setting here a var, but we really don't need a var. A let is more than enough because a let will make sure that our variable is scoped only within this area, which works perfectly for us. Same is true for our children. A let is more than enough. Now, generally speaking, our let is enough because it's within this block, this function scope really for that matter. And in the side of this function scope, we have access all the way to our children, and that's all we really needed. And that is really the difference between const, let, and var. In this lecture, we saw var, const, and let in action. And in the next lecture, we want to just wrap up some of these ES6 topics, so let's explore a little bit of ES6 strings there.